Hi everyone, welcome to my Marriage of Metals video presentation. I hope that by the end of this, I have given you a clear overview of how Marriage of Metal works and how you could potentially incorporate it into your practice later. So I struggled a lot to find historical examples of Marriage of Metals. But basically what I found is that it's a very basic concept that is incorporated with other more complicated processes. Married metal is a term used to define the process of soldering contrasting metals together, usually copper, brass, and silver, using hard solder. Each sheet metal used must all be the same gauge for the process to work and give it that seamless appearance that you see here in this picture. Designs are typically in a puzzle inlay fashion, where each piece is perfectly sawed, sanded, and filed to fit in exactly into the main frame of the design to avoid gaps. Once all of the components have been soldered together, the single piece can be recut and resoldered in contrasting positions for more intricate patterns. The finished panel can be made into a design like earrings or a bracelet, or it can be set like a stone. The reason I mentioned the main frame example, like here in this, like in the silver portion of this piece, is because when I start talking about my piece, the hummingbird, I didn't do that. I didn't quite, not all of the components fit as an inlay, and I'll explain a little bit more once I get into my design, but I'll go back to that. So, because I was having a hard time finding Marriage of Metals, one of the recurring techniques that I saw come up when I was researching this was the Damascene technique. And so this is an example I found on the Met website of Damascene technique. So Damascening is the art of inlaying contrasting metals into one another, usually gold or silver, into a dark oxidized steel background. Also, as with all these techniques, to produce intricate patterns. The English term Damascene comes from a perceived resemblance to the rich tapestry patterns of damask silk. The earliest uses of Damascening have been found in the Aegean from the shaft graves of Mycenae, which date to the latest Middle Bronze Age. Various cities that are known for a rich history in Damascening include, but are not limited to, Malaysia, Indonesia, Toledo, Spain, Eibar, Basque Country in Spain, and Kyoto, Japan. So this is a pair of stirrups from Syria, and the square foot plates and their wide flaring sides is usually found in the Islamic world. This pair is decorated with brass damascened geometric designs and dots of silver inlays. The sockets were originally inlaid with turquoise stones, and most of them have been lost. This was also something I found in on the Met website. And then this I also found on the Met website. There's a lot of armor that involves a lot of damascening and inlaid of metals. This one has, of course, as you can read, copper alloy, gold, silver, and then leather, which I thought was quite beautiful. So another technique that I found as I did this research that also kind of has to do with these contrasting metals was makume gain, which is a Japanese technique which consists of layering also contrasting metals, as I mentioned, and meticulously carving and forging them to create these beautiful wood grain-like patterns. Makume gain was also called Tagaya-sanji because of the patterns resembling the Tagaya-san or rosewood grain pattern. This technique was developed about 400 years ago at the beginning of the Edo period by Shoami Denbei, who was a craftsman making sword fittings and tsubas, or the guard. It's a guard, a sword guard, and part of a sword mounting. It is mounted between the sword's blade and the grip to protect the user's hands. So I thought this was quite beautiful, and I wanted to include it because it's these contrasting metals. So then I also wanted to include this Jim Kelso website that I'm going to take you to, because he has a kind of a tutorial on here of an inlay of this owl, but he doesn't cut out the pieces. I'm just going to quickly go through this tutorial, he carves out the piece, or I'm sorry, not carves, he engraves it, and then he removes the metal with his tools. He cuts out the other piece first, of course, to be as precise as possible, and then uses that as a template to mark the other piece of metal that he engraves. And then he lays the piece that he's cut to fit it into the metal. And then he burnishes it onto the metal. And so I just wanted to show you very, very quickly. He also did the same thing with the beak there, where he carves out that part where he's going to inlay this piece of gold, this piece of gold onto the plate. So that's the finished inlay. So that's another kind of use of metal inlay and using contrasting metals. And then I also ran into this artist named Suzanne Rezak, which I had never heard of either, and she has more clear examples of married metals in her work, and I also love them because she also has these butterfly wings and this other necklace of butterfly wings as well. So I just wanted to include her work in this. Thought it was very fitting. So for this Marriage of Metals project, you mostly will need contrasting metals, however many types of metals you want to use, but just make sure that they're the same gauge, because otherwise you're not going to have that seamless aesthetic. And then you also want to make sure you have a jeweler's saw, and of course your files and sanding paper and all of that, and hard solder to solder all the pieces together. And so once you have your design, you have to identify what the main frame is going to be for your design. Mine was the silver part where I have that S, this one right here. And so but if you can tell, the parts labeled with B, which are the brass parts, they're standalones. They're not going to be inlaid to the metal. So that was a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. Also, the copper on the belly here and the beak, that was separate, but you can still make it work, as I'll show you. So first you trace that main frame onto whatever, of course I chose silver, onto your piece of silver or whatever metal you want to use, and then you start sawing away. But you need to have that main frame first. So once you have that main frame, you want to make sure you identify what are the pieces that are going to be in contact with other metals, because like the ones that I highlighted here, because those are the ones that since this is going to be your template to mark the next sheet of metal, you want to make sure that those are filed and sanded completely before you use this as your template to trace onto the other metal, because if you don't, then once you start filing and you trace this onto another piece of metal, you start filing and sanding, and you realize that you've removed material and it doesn't fit perfectly. So remember, this is like a puzzle, and if you don't file and sand first, it's not going to fit in perfectly, and you're going to do a lot of extra work in vain or have to start all over. So what I did here, I just wanted to show you, and I'm sure a lot of you do this. When you sand, I always put tape on the back of packing tape on the back of my sandpaper, and then cut thin strips because I had very small pieces that I had to sand. I don't think I did a very good job of demonstrating here, but I put my little piece on a vise, and then this was not a very good demo, but I wanted to show you the video anyway. Pretend this is a close-up of your metal. You want to make sure that you sand back and forth as straight as possible. You don't want to remove the corners of your metal, because you don't want to round out those corners, because then you're going to end up with, you don't want to round them, you're going to end up with these rounded edges that when you put them together, when you butt up the edges of the metal, it's not going to be seamless. You're going to have a gap there. You're going to have a little groove there. So you want to make sure that you keep your sandpaper and your file as straight as possible back and forth on the edge of the metal to not round out those edges. Otherwise, it's going to look ugly. So then once you've sanded and filed those edges, then you can use that as your template onto the other pieces of metal like copper or brass. In my case, I used a scribe from printmaking because you want something really, really sharp and you want it as close to that edge as possible. You don't want it wonky. You don't want it very far away. You can either tape it down or you can also use not a vise. Anyway, I forgot the word right now. To make sure that you're holding on your template onto the piece of metal to trace this as closely as possible. So then here, I also wanted to show that I marked these little areas with marker because mine are hand-drawn. They're not from a template. And so sometimes once you take them out and you start filing and sanding, you lose track of which one goes on the top side or on the bottom side, or you lose track. And so you want to make sure that you're not over filing or over sanding. Also, when you saw through your metal, you want to go a little bit outside of the line instead of inside of the line because it's easier, because of course you can always file and sand down, but you can't add back that material that you removed once you've removed it. So you want to be as exact as possible with your sign, with your filing, and with your sanding to make this puzzle work. Oops. So then you want to use a clean brick as possible. You don't want any bricks that have a lot of solder on there once you're ready to start soldering your piece. I use these fabric T-pins to hold everything down. You can always bend them and hold down specific pieces that are kind of sticking out. And you start out by pinning down the main frame and then adding the other components little by little. So that's what I did here. And then you add a ton of hard solder. Mine basically looks like stitchings on there. And and a ton of flux as well. I let my, and of course you want to make sure you're soldering on the back side of your piece because you're going to flood this with solder. So this is a video that I've kind of sped up. Of course, Haley helped me with this, but you want to start heating the whole entire piece. And then little by little, just start letting it flow from one end to another. I know that I probably overheated some parts because they got red hot. And as a lot of you mentioned in your presentation, silver tends to melt more quickly than copper or brass. And so, as you're going to see in a little bit, I ended up soldering my pins onto my piece. And so, as you will see in a bit, once I start taking out the pins, I realize that they're on there. And so you can always go back once you've quenched it, you can always bring it back and reheat it to remove the pins. But that was my mistake. That was because I overheated it at some parts, and you're not supposed to do that. But don't worry if you've basically flooded the back of your piece with solder, because you can always come back and sand it. What you want to avoid, and sometimes it's unavoidable, is to have those gaps, because of course it's not perfect, and of course the metal starts warping, and those little gaps are hard to fill in. But so as you can tell here, I start wiggling off the pins, and those are stuck on there. And as I take it out of the water, and you'll see the pieces all soldered together, but I'll turn it over and the pins are stuck on the back. I should have probably sped up this a little bit more as well. Yep, there they are. So now